All right, so in 13.5, we have this new feature that we're looking to add called sharing production environments at the group level. As some background, we interviewed users about environments and some of the reasons as to why they're not deploying with GitLab. And in some cases, users cited that they have a URL that multiple code bases contribute to. And by URL, it's like a server that multiple code bases contribute to for an end user application. And they want to be able to display in GitLab a connected environment across all these projects. Because today, if you were to add that same target URL in project one and name it the same thing, so production to app in project one, and then production to app in project two, they would display as two separate environments everywhere. They would behave in GitLab as two separate environments. They would show up on the environments dashboard as two separate environments. In one particular use case that this customer walked me through is that they have a single AWS environment for a SaaS solution. And they have a different code base contributing to their front end, and they have a different code base contributing to their back end, and it's deploying to the same AWS environment for a customer. So they were expecting to be able to have project one front end and project two back end to be able to share the same URL and to display and sync those deployments together, but they're not able to orchestrate that in GitLab today, because there isn't any like dependent planning, there isn't any connection, there isn't any visualization that we can group together in either the YAML so that it's like imperative or inside of the UI. So I'm trying to think of ways for us to allow this application modeling inside of GitLab. And it's kind of a tricky problem to solve because we don't really have a structure other than groups and projects to afford like a hierarchical grouping of deployments and environments in this way. So that's what this feature is supposed to be solving. It's this application that has many code bases contributing to it, and to group those in a way that a user can plan and orchestrate releases accordingly.
So is the core need the ability to or the way they want to use it is to be able to deploy, in that example, both the backend and the front end at the same time, and kind of do it not separately?
Right. Or to be able to track the health of that one end state application based on all the inputs that go into it. So I have this application, and now I have to monitor two separate projects as two separate environments to make sure that that single application, that end user experience, is healthy, right?
Yeah, I completely, now I finally understand the problem specification. So yeah, it's almost like microservices, right? So there's a number of projects that together are making the single production environment effectively. So I got a bit confused with this thing where we can have the same URL assigned to multiple projects. It kind of doesn't make a lot of sense to me actually, but I guess because even in that particular example, there's really only one part of the whole stack is actually serving up, you know, the web server, right? Like the front end is probably getting compiled and then pushed to the, you know, but okay, so that's where we are now. But so I looked again at the multi-project pipelines, but I think that's actually something a bit different because that's producing multiple environments for a single project. But in fact, we want the opposite, right? We want, and I'm surprised we don't support this already.
Yeah, and that's kind of like, if we do support it, it's not particularly intuitive to users today. So like if we were to think about a DAG application or a pipeline that uses DAG inside of GitLab, we could probably trigger pipelines and other projects to then contribute or deploy to another. So like it compiles and builds all of these different changes into a single pipeline, and that has a targeted production URL. But again, this kind of is working across multiple pipelines and projects and doesn't solve for the visibility of the application inside of GitLab.
Yeah, and just to kind of get a more concrete example in my own head, like an example might be, okay, say you've got a Rails app, and that's a back-end Rails app, and then you've got like a front-end project that's eventually compiled into static assets that get served by the web server. But then secondly, maybe you've got another, for example, a Python project that's doing machine learning, and that's used by the Rails backend. And so all those three things together are the actual environment. And you might say they all might get released together, or they might get updates might get applied independently to each of those pieces. So you not only kind of have an environment issue, you kind of have, in a way, there's two environments actually, right? Because there's the machine learning environment and there's the web server environment. But there's even, how do you handle versioning between, what version are we up to as a whole versus.
Well, that's where I think like group releases come into play, which is another feature that we have down the road as we start to like build these different building blocks. What we're actually developing here is this portfolio view of application deployment. We're no longer thinking about a single repository, but we're thinking about how do we create applications in GitLab. And we're using, and we're kind of using these different existing components in GitLab and trying to elevate them to the group level as umbrellas for places where code really exists. Like, for example, you're totally right in that it doesn't necessarily make sense to have a group environment because there's no code at the group. So it makes sense though to like the end user to say, I want to be able to have visibility that these different projects are contributing to the same application for my end user, because that's the end state that we're trying to capture here. And that's what we're that's the kind of thing that we're trying to create with group releases too, is how do we connect all of these components that feed into my end user's application as a customer.
And so does that mean though, like the simplest MVC would be, so maybe we actually have two environments, right? Like we have, for example, in that example, we have like a web server, web application environment, and then we have a separate, some type of backend, a machine learning or some other environment. But then at the group level, we want to be able to see the health of everything. Is that, have I correctly stated that?
I think we could create, like, here's two approaches that I was trying to articulate here. One approach was we surfaced to users the ability to create an object that connects project deployments together. And the only way that I knew how to articulate that was by creating a single environment URL and allowing projects to deploy to that single environment URL. But I think you're right, and we could support multiple URLs, multiple servers, and have them assigned to different projects, but creating a visual indication at the group level that these different projects are feeding into this application. So maybe we create in group environments, maybe it's actually like your applications or something on the side panel, and it allows people to name their application, and then they can feed different environments from all these different projects into that view.
I think the two things that confuse me, which are getting much clearer now, is this idea of a shared URL, and then the other thing was, how to deploy when you don't actually have code. But if this is correct, and shoot me down if it's wrong, one thing we're looking at, one part of what we're looking at here is, so we have a group and say it has two projects underneath it, and each of those projects currently has an environment, but we're trying to surface those two environments together, which are the application together, and maybe under a different name at the group level. So we would see production environment, and then we would click on it, and then we would see web server, or, web environment, and machine learning environment.
I think what's weird is that, well, what's weird is that the user, what they showed me is they have like this AWS link that they copy pasted into their current orchestration system. And they said, this is my production environment. And I have these 3 different code bases feeding into that one production environment. So I'm not sure, like, the way that they outlined it in Electric Flow is that there was this one AWS bucket that they had like a little graphic of AWS logo. And then they had these lines going from front end, and it was a little React logo, and it was a line feeding into that. And then they had a little database icon feeding into that. And then they had then they had like a node,
back end,
a node little signal, and that was feeding into this URL. So like the visual diagram that they were showing me and what they're articulating to me is that I have a single environment as a SaaS solution that I'm building for my customers, and this is the link that they go to for it. And like, that's why I'm using the word like URL and single server.
Sure,
they have all these different things feeding into it. So I'm not sure like if there's other environments that they're deploying to in that single URL. Because
that example makes a lot of sense. So in fact, looking at it from the end user's perspective, they come to a URL, right? So the URL is attached to, in our example, to the group level. And but then that's kind of like an umbrella for these 3 pieces: the database, the back end, and the front end, that are separately developed, probably deployed separately, but they can't all, they're all part of the same thing, which is represented by what's at the group level, and there's a single entry point, I guess.
Right.
Yeah, I think that URL, currently we don't really do much with it from GitLab's perspective. It's mostly just to generate links that when you click it, it'll go to the right URL. So I think it really is kind of an end user facing feature. It's just, where can I actually view and access this production environment? So to me, that kind of makes sense that you might have 3 different microservices that all are accessed through the same endpoint.
Okay. So does it make a lot of sense, or not a lot of sense? Because I feel like we are still getting kind of jammed up on like this use case where customers are saying, I have like a single place I'm deploying code from all these different repos. And then of course, like there's a comment that you made, Sean, around if project A, the front end code deploys, it'll overwrite what's existing in that target URL. And then if a database deploys a change, it'll overwrite that. But if they are not connected code repositories and they deploy, I'm not sure if it like would remove the backend.
Because really they're deploying to different places, right?
Yeah,
because the database is deploying, it's not deploying to a web server, right? It's deploying to something in database land.
right.
And the back end, front end, that's a bit debatable, but at the end of the day, there's only going to be one actual web server, or fleet of web servers. But
perfect.
there might be, for example, a front end web server and a back end web server but then they eventually would go through to some type of proxy that would have the actual URL attached to it. So I think I kind of get it. It's slightly abstract still, but using that example, I think at the group level, we just attach the 3 projects, and then we have some way of specifying a URL, that's really kind of informational actually, right, at the group level. And then, we have health statuses on the underlying 3 environments. Is that what you're thinking?
Well, 3 environments kind of threw me for a loop there, because I'm not sure, like, again, like when I talk to these end users, though, what they're harping on is like, I might have these 3 different code bases, but my pipelines are building this thing, and this
single
thing gets then sent to this one other thing.
Okay, sure.
But I want to be able to visualize all these little things that are feeding into that one experience for my end user. But I agree that maybe it should be flexible enough that if users want to get granular, say that their YAML files do have project A feeding to this other web server for front end, project B feeding to the database land, project C feeding to a backend web server, and then they want to represent at the group level the target URL for the application, that we allow them to be able to bucket those different web servers.
Yeah, I think there's actually two different use cases, right? So one is there's a single project made of three separate components that are deployed separately, and are really 3 different environments, or maybe the case that the user is describing is actually a bit like GitLab Omnibus, where there are multiple pieces and they're all pushed and it's made into this big, slug or this big thing, and then that's pushed up to the cloud kind of in one go. And maybe that's kind of what they're trying to articulate there. And they're two kind of quite different use cases, actually.
And I think today they could, the piece that's missing is them being able to visualize each separate environment as a single application for that second use case. Like they want to be able to connect these different environments as a single application, because their end user experiences those 3 different environments as one thing. And then there's the first use case that we don't offer a way to physically share that same target URL to different YAML files and see those as one environment.
Yeah, so it is very similar to the problem we solved with GitLab Omnibus, because GitLab Omnibus really it's more or less intended to be deployed to a single server, but it's got everything on it. It's got the database, it's got the web server, and which is not it's kind of old school deployment, right? It's using Chef. It's not using.
You're totally right. This is a legacy style deployment.
Yeah.
It's not containers, right? And that's
exactly.
Kind of
it's definitely not containers. Yeah, precisely.
That could be our biggest gap here, is that we are supporting a legacy historical way of release management, where we are not doing cloud native, structures, clusters, pods on a single platform, But that's where we're getting gained right now as well, from the analyst perspective, is being able to support legacy style development and deployment.
I wonder, would it be possible to a bit more engagement with the specific customer, or is there any documents or anything?
So I wasn't able to record it because they're a regulated customer, but I can try to reach back out to them and see if there's more details that we can provide. But I also feel like from a competitive standpoint, we can look at Electric Flow as a great example of ways to how can we build an application modeling tool without building the visualization of a flow inside of GitLab? How can we visually indicate that things are related in GitLab? I think it's like the real problem that we're trying to solve for this application development.
Yeah, and the most basic level, we should be able to do that through groups. Right, we should be able to surface what's in the underlying projects in a more digestible, a single view, right? Of here's all my projects and here's all the pieces. And if there are, sub environments, maybe is the right term. If there's environments down at the project level, well, the environments have to be attached to a project, as I understand it, because the project is producing the code, right? So, but as I put in the diagram, the way that environments are attached to project is through deployments. They're not directly attached to projects, actually.
Environment.
And then, so the project has deployments, and then I did a diagram in the issue.
Yeah,
the project has
I was pulling it
deployments.
back up. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the deployment, is produces the environment. So there is an indirect. I mean, the deployment's always attached to a project, but there is an indirect link there that we could possibly leverage. We could show those deployments at the group level, maybe, but they would still need to be connected to the project because the project has a source code. But unless we have some type of new kind of super environment that's kind of made up of these, But I do think we're kind of talking about two different things here, because one use case is the use case where there is, there's multiple, let's say multiple servers that are each built separately, and then they together make the application, versus something where all this stuff from 3 or 4 different repos is packaged up and made into this big thing, a bit like GitLab Omnibus, and then pushed together. And they're different use cases.
Okay, so I want to figure out
we can support both.
Yeah, we probably will need to support both, but I think what I'm trying to prioritize right now is what's the most useful change that we can add to visually indicate that projects are related and feeding into the same end user application. Because I think that will address both use cases, whether that's I have these 3 different microservices projects that all have their own pipelines for building, and actually they compile into a single release pipeline, and that feeds into that single environment. But I want to be able to indicate that's related. These projects are all related to one application. And then there's a second use case that there's 3 different projects contributing to 3 different environments that are all feeding into the same end user application.
Yeah. So one probably the simplest way that comes to mind is that the environments dashboard that we currently have be actually linked to a group, and then it's what's on that dashboard is only what's in the group's projects. No?
Yeah, so I don't think the environments dashboard is where this will be solved, because it's not discoverable, and it's not linked to like the actual group. It's at the instance level, so it wouldn't be like managing related projects and repositories. It's going to be like visibility of a specific environment. Their job to be done is so different there.
So if we did something like, if we had a link off project, off group that said environments, and then that would then show in some way all of the environments of the projects that belong to that group. Would that be a first step? Well, we might want to filter by environment name, for example, or have some type of settings. I put forward the environments dashboard just as a single view, but of course it can look completely different. But I guess what I'm trying to get to is the environments dashboard at the moment, users choose what goes on that, whereas what we're looking for, I think, is what belongs to this group, and to give me a snapshot of what belongs to this group and what's its current state.
And if they're
it sounds like we need
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
It sounds like we need just a group environments page, like similar to the project environments page.
I like that. And
I was thinking too, I'll share my screen real quick of the current. So this is just a project environment page. And we already have this concept of like grouping them. So just basically by the name, if you name them like grandparent / parent / the front end groups them into folders. So I don't know if we could use the same concept and maybe link them by the URL. So like, let's say if 3 different projects all have the same URL, we could instead on the group page have this parent would be the URL, and then you open it up, and then
I love
each of those are just the children in the projects. Like that could be a way that we use the same pattern.
Hannah, this looks a lot like our prototypes. This is good. Nathan, thank you for saying that.
Let me share my screen then. I've been quiet because it's nice to see that what's in your head right now. It's similar to what we're prototyping. I added to the agenda, but I'm also going to drop here in the chat so you can follow my clicks, but I'm going to share my screen real quick. Let me see. Yeah, there you go. You can see it, right? Figma? I see
Yep.
a lot of All right, cool. Hold on, it's loading. Yeah. So this is the group view. And then what we did here is that we added an operations menu, similar to what we have in the project level. So when you click it, it will expand, and then you have just one option for environments. So if I click here, I navigate, still loading. It's not loading, but I navigate to the environment overview page.
Oh, it loaded for us, Hayana. That was weird. Yeah, we saw it.
Hold up. And then for some reason I cannot see but there are text.
So how do they get put under this heading of production? So it's production 2. How does that heading get generated?
So here it will be the name of the environment, right, that you give at the group level. So in this view, you have an option to create a new group environment. This was our initial proposal. Or you would show all the existing environments that share the same URL, and they're called production, and they're going to be populated in this view.
I think I'm leaning toward what Nathan said, which is if there's a way for us to pre-populate this page with things that already share the same URL in the project or in the group. And I think that we can populate it with the URL name. I do feel like it'd be useful for us to enable users to add their own name as a future iteration. Like they may want to call that URL production for application A, or whatever.
Yep.
That's interesting. And then here in the detail view, in the list view, it's pretty much the same information that you see at the project level. So your latest deployment to production on GitLab, on Pajamas, on GitLab Docs. So same info. If you click here, you go to see the latest deployment to GitLab. You click the I, you go see the list where all the deployments. And here on the top, you have the URL, which will be production.gitlab. Clicking here, you go to that view, or you have the settings. I don't have a prototype for that, but you have the option, change the name, change this name in production, or I don't know, add alerts, do whatever you want there. Any comments on this view?
It looks great. I mean, it's good because it's very similar to what we have now, and so an understood motif. And the idea of linking it through the URL is very simple, I think. And I guess that we more or less would just take all these features that we have at the project level, and we would just pass it through. Actually, I mean, we would still be executing the build effectively at the project level, but it will be viewable from this. Here's the group, and then here's everything that's in the group that's attached to this URL.
That's exactly it. Yeah, this is the visibility at the group, right?
And we could even show like this group page by default could be all of the environments in your group in the sub projects, and then just they automatically group when they share the same URL. So it's kind of just a view all and then optionally grouping.
That might be interesting. We tried to contain scope by just limiting production because I didn't know how that would do with performance, especially if it is a cloud native application, or you do have one inside of your group. You could use review apps, and then you could have hundreds of thousands of dynamic URLs in this view. So I was a little anxious into how that would visually impact the performance and the page, just everything. But I would be totally open to extending it to all environments.
Well, if we start with focusing on, what's the minimum, if we focus on um, a single environment, production environment is going to be the one that's interesting. So I guess in the settings in our first version, we might just have the possibility of adding a single URL. It would then go and get whatever is attached to that URL. And then as customers ask for it, we could start looking at staging in other environments.
Would we even need to do, the user have to explicitly add things to this dashboard, or could we just look at everything that's there and just kind of auto-populate it without having them to go and create it?
Great question. The only reason why we have the create functionality is that we thought that might, I thought that may have been like the lower entry point here to enable users to group their deployments together at the group level. But if auto-populating is actually a lower lift, then we can prioritize that first. My thought is, say that it's a brand new GitLab customer and now they have this offering to them. They want to create their YAML files, and at the project level, they want to have a group environment that they're leveraging. They would create the group environment and then build that inside of their YAML files. But it's more like the order of operations that is unvalidated directly with users.
Yeah, looking at this page that you've got on screen now, hi Anna. So yeah, so name would be, they're the only two pieces of information we would need to as a minimum, right? What is a URL? So then it just, even this projects box we could maybe not have in the first version. So if you just put in the URL, that's the production URL, it then goes through all of its sub projects and subgroups and finds anything that's got that URL and just surfaces it, and then you can call it whatever you want, and using the name field. And then perhaps later we could start, having, filter by subgroup and all that stuff. But I think most setups are not going to have huge amounts of subgroups with their production environments. They might have a couple, but if we just go and get them all and then we deal with who wants something else, then they can tell us, and we can do that as a second iteration maybe.
The one piece that I can see being a little bit of a maintenance burden would be if you ever change your external URL in your projects, you'd have to also come back here and edit this in order to keep them grouped properly. So that might be another argument towards kind of just dynamically generating the page from the URLs.
Yeah. I mean, we can also do that, I think.
Yeah, it's more of an implementation thing, I think, because it'd be, if it's really like performance would suffer from that, or if it's tricky to implement, maybe not. But
I wonder if users want to know, like once you enter the URL, you want to have a way to validate which projects are going to be, of course you can still do when you create and hit create and you see on the list, but while I'm creating, am I interested in knowing if it's going to show for pajamas, GitLab UI runner, etc. If there's a way for us to bring that here to the UI once you type the URL.
Yeah, like see where that exists before you say create new.
Yeah, because otherwise you have to go, I don't know, I'm just thinking of the edge cases here. What if you don't want for a specific project, but it has a URL?
And I think
so maybe there's a exclude button or something. So you get the list and then you just go, I don't want these ones.
But that would be more of a second iteration kind of thing, right? Like,
yeah,
I'm assuming we wouldn't need that right away. Yeah.
Or third, I'm thinking that the whole create, now that you guys surface that the dynamic population would be not necessarily easy or small effort, but like, more intuitive from like just percolating information up to from the project. I feel like that should be the first priority, because the goal of this, the problem we're trying to solve is this visibility of things that are shared. And then that directly confronts that problem. Second and third iterations are more like interactions with how they want to act on that visibility. And that might be, I want to protect environments at that view. I want to change permissions at that view. I want to see my deployments at that view, or I want to create a new environment. But I do feel like the creation of a new environment probably needs to go through validation, because if it's already pre-populated on this page and then we add filtering and sorting, creation might not necessarily be a priority for our users.
Just to add to that, also something you mentioned earlier, Jackie, about maybe you have hundreds of staging environments or whatever. A way to deal with that would be to have like a wildcard, accept a wildcard URL, and if that if the environments are named staging 1, 2, 3 or whatever, then that would be a mechanism by which they could be filtered out, for example.
Look at you.
Or grouped together. Yeah.
That's a great
suggestion.
Sean, you're awesome.
The other thing too, like way down the road, having this grouping mechanism would also allow us to do things like stop a whole environment, like you could just trigger all the auto stop behaviors of all the sub environments, or like redeploy all, something kind of management at that high level.
Reboot all.
Rollbacks. Yes.
No, in fact, actually, when you think about that's a great idea, because maybe if you're being attacked, for example, you want to take everything offline in one go, right? You want a single button that can do that. It might not be actually stop, but it might be remove all the internet access or something like that.
Yeah. Like take them offline. Yeah.
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 Or
if you're
take them
triggering
offline, exactly.
Yeah. Or if you're triggering a release of all your microservices and they've all been built, now you just want to release them all at once and kind of schedule them that way.
Something that's also interesting from a competitor standpoint, when we look at Jenkins and CloudBees, there's this functionality of being able to schedule a deployment and sequence deployments. So that would be what I could see users wanting to do from here is like, okay, I want this project to deploy first. And once I get an OK to schedule the second one and then the third one, because sometimes these projects may be organizing incremental rollouts, different cohorts of customers. So if they have a different project per end user for a particular product that they're managing, they may want to trigger those events from that view. Because they can do that today in like Jenkins, schedule and create dependencies between deployments. Okay.
Just to validate, so if we did group things based on the URL, are there any cases where that wouldn't work, where people would only group things that have different URLs? Or is that a safe enough assumption that if they have the same URL, they should be grouped?
So I know that I've heard in interviews with users that they are, the ones that aren't deploying with GitLab, they are using a single URL as an indicator of their application. So that's like a broad use case of people not using GitLab. But I would be interested if there would be kind of like what we were talking before. I do have an end application, but I have these 3 different environments that are feeding into that application. So they may want the option to be able to group non-same URL things into a single group environment. And maybe that's where create new environment and you create your name, your target URL, and you have the ability to add projects to that one. And then that group environment is really just an artificial URL or an artificial bucket, because it's not really an application.
Jackie, when you mentioned now about having non-group URLs feed into a single environment, blah, 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 I wonder, should we call these group environments? Shouldn't we just call like deployments? I don't know, because like what Sean said in the beginning, you don't have really a code base at the group level, but you are indeed just showing how everything links back to this one URL. And as a user, of course, I'm not I'm not one of the personas, but whenever I have to find the deployment, I have to go to operations environment, and I find that very unnatural. And I was just wondering here if we should be dealing with the deployment and not the environment per se.
So I think that we don't have a thing called deployment in GitLab today. So we would need to work with the operations side panel team right now. I think Configure's doing all of the research on what the side panel should look like. So my gut reaction is that you're absolutely right. Environments don't exist at the group. It's kind of like what we're talking about with releases too. Since there's no code at the group, anything that's attached to code doesn't really make sense at the group.
Yeah.
But since things exist under the group that are touching code and people want to be able to see all those things in one place, it makes sense to surface those patterns up, even though they aren't necessarily exactly the same thing. So if we think about a group just being a holder or a container for all the things that actually action the code, then I think environments is appropriate. But deployments, we should consider looking at the research that happens after Configure comes out with it, because we did propose deployments as being a side panel option, and then that would contain feature flags, A/B testing, experiments, releases, because deployments really is what all that's all about, you know.
And I think that's also part of the problem where in the research, the initial results where people are like, nah, I don't know what deployments are, right? I don't really work with deployments. It's just that there's nothing really referring to it in the product, but they are this collection of.
And yet it's a really crucial part of the CI/CD, right? Is all the CD. So I didn't realize it's not. Yeah, you're right. It's not really surfaced anywhere, but because we kind of represent it through environments, but in fact, it does go through that path. And if you look at a product like Heroku, they have this great page, which I got to say, when I first started working with it, I was so happy. So basically they have every deployment you do, they just have them in a list. They have the deployments, and it has the, it's not even as advanced as what you're saying, Jackie. All they have is they have the deployment and then the Git hash that the deployment was made from. But then they have this button that says roll back to here. And in one, sometimes depending what you do with your database, it's not always possible, but in general, and I've used it in production instances where you deploy something, it's all wrong, and you can roll back like a couple of deployments, very easily. And it's it's a UI. Anyway, that's just completely off base, but it's because it's it's from the deployment's view, it's not from the environment's view.
I love that. So initial gut reaction, Hayana, I think what our MBC here is, what the issues that we'll create and schedule for 13.5 will be add group environment page that's dynamically populated with project environments. And then our second iteration would be after we get feedback from users and after we look at the operation side panel work, that we can rebrand that to deployments.
Sounds good.
And then fourth and fifth iteration will be creating group environments or pooling that into the environments dashboard. Because I do think once we create this object that people can tie a group environment to the environments dashboard, that they would be able to link all their related applications. And I think going back to your point, Sean, there's definitely an opportunity there to create better visibility and solve some of the problems that we are trying to solve in our redesign efforts, Hayana, with this new object. And then taking a group environment and showing it to a group release, people would be able to see all related deployments for an end user application, which is what they're missing inside of GitLab today.
Exactly.
Oh, beautiful.
Full circle. So here's what I'll do. I'll create that issue of add dynamically populated page at the group environment level. And Nathan, Sean, I would love your help either breaking that down or sizing it so that we can make sure we have that scope scheduled for 13.5. Because Hayana, not sure like where the prototypes are out there, but hopefully we can use what you've shown today as the baseline for that.
Sure. And just a quick question. Do you want to create, because now we have an issue, do you want it to be an umbrella or we change the scope of the existing one?
So the existing one, I'll probably promote to an Epic as sharing production environments, or renaming it to something that makes more sense. And then the first iteration will be this idea of a group environment page. And then we'll have other future scope that kind of carves out that issue a little bit more.
Okay, then I'll add the design specs there
Perfect.
with all these different views.
Okay. I feel so relieved because I was like, this feature is going to be a pain in the neck. So I'm glad that it's not.
I think it's something that can grow into something huge, but the MVC I think is pretty well defined actually.
That means a lot. That makes me feel better about this. Because whenever I get really hard questions from you, Sean, I can tell my anxiety goes up because I know,
Sorry,
oh my gosh,
sorry.
I'm being unrealistic. No, it's like a reflection of my like product manager fairy dust. I'm like, I'm not being real.
Like she wants what?
I know that's what it is, and I'm like, no.
Really?
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. If there's any other questions, let me know, but I'll ping you on these issues. And Hannah, you and I will definitely sync on this. Let me know if you need anything in the meantime. Okay. All right. I'll post this recording. Talk to you soon.
See ya.